My name is Carl Shalahorn. I'm a member of the United Church of Christ Mental Health Network Board of Directors. I'm from Buffalo, New York, and I serve as the Director of Community Advocacy for the Mental Health Association of Erie County and Compeer-Buffalo. My presentation will focus on information related to the signs and symptoms of anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and substance abuse, as well as how the church has historically treated those living with mental health conditions. It will also touch on barriers to effective ministry and successful church-based models that address mental illness among congregants. This is important because we all know someone who lives with a mental health condition, and the church is no different. Many times people do not feel comfortable disclosing about their condition. The church needs to be a place where people feel accepted and understood. I hope you're able to take something away from this video, whether it be for yourself, for someone you know, or for those in your church. Thank you for watching. Well, good afternoon. We're here to talk about mental health in the church. And with this topic, there are, of course, any number of different approaches and things that you'd want to know about. So essentially today we're going to look at basically some of the basic information around various mental health disorders, as well as things such as how the church looks at mental health and things that we can do to open up that conversation and begin to be more accepting and welcoming of those with mental health challenges. So we're going to kind of go over a number of those things. Just to kind of keep it in perspective though, there are a lot of issues here that I'm going to be touching on, and it's just going to be in many ways an overview. We can get a lot deeper, and of course there are other opportunities to do that today. So these are some things we're going to be looking at as far as just the general topics. Like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about behavioral health itself, what that is, kind of go into some of the basic disorders, and then I'm going to describe what a caring environment is, and then going into some of the other things like their mental health, what is that definition, the model of friendship, which is a type of approach to mental health in our congregations, looking at a multicultural faith community, role of faith community, serious mental illness, silence in the congregation, and also stigma. So these are all terms that are often used associated with mental health, but also more specifically when it comes to mental health in the church. So this is the definition of behavioral health. And when you think about behavioral health, what you want to consider are the things that it applies to. So when you think of behaviors as things that we do, something that we act out on. So it's a state of mental and emotional being or choices and actions that affect wellness. And when you think about the word wellness, that's, of course, that word is used a lot these days as far as, you think about physical health, and we're always hearing about exercising and eating our, fruits and vegetables. Well, wellness is actually comprised of a variety of dimensions. There are a number of things associated with wellness aside from just that physical aspect. There's a mental and emotional aspect of wellness. There's financial, there's occupational, social, environmental. So there are a lot of different aspects to wellness. However, they can all be affected by one's mental state. So that's something that we often want to look at. In terms of our faith communities, what is a caring environment? So we want to really create a place where people feel comfortable, they feel secure, they feel that they're being accepted, that they're being recognized as who they are as a whole person. We also want to be sympathetic to people's needs. We want to understand that some people are in need of assistance and that they might need help when it comes to managing different aspects of their lives. Mental health itself is on a spectrum. It basically falls anywhere from people being well to unwell, and we all fall somewhere on that spectrum at any given time. So when you think about it, you might be having a very difficult day. You might be falling somewhere on that spectrum that might be not as healthy. You might be having a really good day, so you might be on that part of the spectrum where you're feeling really well. But we all fall somewhere on that spectrum. There's some individuals, however, that are on the spectrum that tend to be more on the side of being unwell as a result of having a mental health condition. And for some, these issues are being treated. However, there are a number that these issues are not being treated. One of the statistics that we know is that 1 out of 5 people lives with a mental health diagnosis. We also know that 4 out of 10 people are receiving treatment. There's another 60% that are not receiving treatment for mental health issues in this country alone. So think about that. In terms of our congregations, how many people are there that might be suffering in silence? They might not want to share or disclose what's going on with them. They may not want to feel comfortable with being open. We want to be able to provide this caring environment so that they know that it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to be able to share openly and be accepted without being judged. That's one thing that we know, that with the stigma surrounding mental illness, people often feel like they're being judged for something that really is oftentimes beyond their control. And one of the things I'm going to touch on briefly here today is substance use, and as I go into that a little bit later, but when you think about substance use, you talk about addiction. That is something that, even though people will often say, people have control over, it's a choice, sometimes it's not as simple as that. So we're going to touch on that later. So what is mental health? Basically, it's a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, the ability to cope with the normal stressors of life. A person can work productively and fruitfully, and they're able to make a contribution to his or her community. Now, this is when you think about the optimal sense of mental health. There are times, of course, when mental health can be compromised, and this is often due to having a disorder of one kind or another. When you think about those that you might know, or it might even be yourself, that has a mental health diagnosis, sometimes your mental health is compromised. Sometimes you aren't able to carry out those activities like you normally would. Many people, because of their mental health, cannot work, or might have to leave work, even if it's just for a brief period of time, because of that. One of the things I do in my day job is I talk to businesses and organizations about mental health and how it impacts the workplace. Many people go to work. They have an issue with what's called presenteeism, where a person's at work, but they're not really focused on what they're doing. They're really, if anything, distracted from being able to understand or being able to do their work, to focus and get their job done, because they're so worried about what might be going on in other aspects of their lives. So this is in terms of mental health. We're thinking about really trying to optimize or help a person to be as healthy as possible. There's another concept called the model of friendship. And it's simply just like it states, being able to accept and be a friend to someone. We talk about the idea of stigmatization of mental illness. What this does is it really is a counteract or a counter way of looking at that, a counteraction. The idea of being a friend to someone is a means of just basically accepting them as they are, being able to be there when they need it, to be supportive. And as a church, this is something that I think we're called to do, to be supportive of those who are in need. I mean, that's basically, that was Christ's ministry right there, helping those that are in need. So when you are able to recognize that and be in a situation where you can help someone in your congregation, or even outside your congregation, might be in your personal life, or someone a neighbor, a coworker, I believe that's what Christians were called to do. And by being able to follow this model, being able to follow this means of helping people, when we serve others, we get served ourselves. For myself, I'm a person who lives with a mental health condition. I have bipolar disorder. And I know when I first had my first episode at the age of 18, and I was in college, I spent many years, going in and out of hospitals. I was, abusing drugs, and I really was in a very, very precarious situation for a long time, where I frankly didn't know what the future would hold for me. I was very fortunate, however, to have people who cared, people who helped. I recall my own minister, the pastor who confirmed me. I would call him middle of the night, and he would take the time to listen and just be there for me and be present. That was so, looking back on that, it was so incredibly valuable and important for me to have that someone who I could talk to, because I couldn't talk to my parents about it. They didn't understand. I certainly couldn't talk to my friends. They didn't understand. But my pastor listened. I don't even think he really understood, but he listened, right? And sometimes what we need is really just someone there to listen to us. So by having this model of friendship, that's what really friends do. We listen, and we are there to listen non-judgmentally. That's really critical too when you think about working with someone that might have a mental health challenge. We want to listen without judgment. So what is the role of the faith community? I believe that as a faith community, we are charged by God to help our brothers and sisters in Christ. And being compassionate, being open, helping to advocate for others, to address the stigma that exists is so very important, so very important. Even within our congregations, I believe, in some at least, that stigma still exists, which is why many suffer in silence, like I said before. So think about it maybe in the context of where you're at in terms of your church home. How is it handled? How is it treated? Do people speak up? Do people take action? I think right now we're in a part in our lives, as a community, as a country, where mental health is certainly becoming more recognized. It's realized that it's more important to address. And I think even within our churches, it's becoming more important to address these issues, simply because it's just so present. It's all around us. And really, when you think about it, it was stated earlier in one of the core groups that the people that come to church are the ones that often need it the most. We are the people who are broken sometimes, who come to church for that relief, for that sense of understanding and compassion. So that's what we want to be able to do as a faith community, is to, I guess you could say, rally around those that need it. Because when you think about it, they're the ones that need it the most. There is a term called serious mental illness. It used to be called serious pervasive mental illness, SPMI. Now it's just simply called serious mental illness. Really what we're talking about here are the cases that are more pronounced, might be more difficult to deal with for a person in terms of their activities of daily living, their ADLs, that's another term that's used, or the ability to go to work or go to school. So for those who live with serious mental illness, these conditions really affect someone to the point where they can't function the way they used to. So basically, we're talking about something that's mental, behavioral, emotional in nature. Also, we look at it being within the past year oftentimes in terms of that initial diagnosis. And then, of course, the diagnosis is based on what's in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is as they say, the Bible of American psychiatry. That's where you'll find all of the various mental health disorders in terms of their diagnoses, their signs, or symptoms that are associated with it. So these would have to meet those that we call the diagnostic criteria from the DSM. And as I said, there's that serious functional impairment, whether it be going to work or school, activities of daily living, relationships. Think about the people that you might know that might have a serious mental illness. How have their lives been impacted in terms of their relationships? Often they are fractured. Oftentimes people are shunned or they're cast away by their families or friends because of what they're living with. Now, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of that person. Think about what that must feel like if you can't be around your family because you're not accepted by your family. So that goes back to what is the role of the faith community. I think it's time for us to understand that because there are people who are having these problems that they can't entirely handle on their own, they may need help from others. And I think we as a church can do that. We can be there for them. And this is, I want to just say, the killer. We often talk about, stress and heart disease is a silent killer. Hypertension is a silent killer. Well, mental illness is also, can be a killer in terms of just how it affects people. When people can't get help, they run the risk of facing even more problems, and in a worst case scenario, even death. For some that are living with mental illness, it is truly a life or death situation when you think about it. We know that 90% of the cases of people that complete suicide have some type of a mental health diagnosis. 90%. So that is also something to consider. And when you think about it, many, if not most congregations still deal with mental illness in terms of silence. It's not something that is comfortably spoken about. It's not something that is discussed. It's something that is oftentimes, swept under the rug or just not acknowledged. But people will be suffering. People do suffer in silence. Stigma is something that has been around since basically the dawn of ages, when you think about it. Of course, I'm sure we understand where the word comes from, stigmata. Those are the signs that Jesus had on his hands and feet. So stigma is, in this case, however, stems from that word, but in this case it means it's a mark of disgrace. It's a negative term. It's something that basically keeps people from getting help. Stigma is one of the reasons why it takes people an average of up to 10 years to seek professional treatment. So imagine walking around with a broken leg for 10 years and not getting help for that. How painful that must be. So put yourself in the shoes of someone that has an actual mental health disorder and going along that amount of time without getting help. We talk about suffering, that's suffering. And that's oftentimes suffering in silence. And a lot of reasons why this stigma exists is there are a lot of myths around mental illness. The media certainly is not a big help in this area either, whether it be movies or TV shows or news. The media has typically over time not cast a very good light on mental illness. Of course, there are some cases where there may be movies that might approach it in a more compassionate way, but for the most part, it's received very, very bad portrayals of people that do have mental health disorders. So we want to change that. We want to change that. One of the ways we could change that is by the language that they use. When you think about those terms that we often use when we think about people with mental illness, crazy, wacko, nuts, right? We want to eliminate those words from our vocabulary. I think it's really important that when we think about those that are living with mental health disorders, we are considerate of what they're going through, we're respectful, and we don't use those words because those words can become self-stigmatizing, right? A person might hear these messages from other people and they begin to internalize these statements and begin to take for lack of a better term, buy into them themselves as far as how they see themselves. They self-stigmatize. So what ends up happening is they feel they can't get help. They feel that there's no point of going on. What's the use, right? So that's another thing to consider as well. So stigma is very, very big as far as one of the things we need to address. So depression. Depression is one of the diagnoses that people can have when it comes to mental illness. It's one of the most prevalent mental health disorders. So major depressive disorder, we say, we want to see it as being something that lasts at least 2 weeks. We've all been sad from time to time. We all know what it's like to have a difficult period, but when you experience these symptoms that affect one's emotions, thinking, behavior, and physical well-being, the ability to work and have satisfying relationships. If it's more than 2 weeks and it's not going away, it's not getting better, then maybe it's time to consider seeing someone or trying to get help. And here are some of the symptoms that we look at when we think about depression. Persistent sadness, anxiousness, feelings of hopelessness. Like I said myself, when I had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, of course there's periods of mania, the highs, but the lows, those are the ones that really get you. I remember the summer of 1983, I couldn't even get out of bed practically to do anything. It was just that bad. It was just that bad. So what ends up happening is you have no hope. You think it's not going to get any better. There may be feelings of guilt or worthlessness or helplessness. There might be a loss of interest in things that you normally enjoy or have pleasure from. When I was young, and I still now actually enjoy, one thing I enjoy is music. I love music, but when I was going through that profound period of depression, I couldn't listen to any music, nothing, just flat. It didn't do anything for me. And for myself, that was highly unusual, highly unusual. There might be decreased energy, fatigue, That's also another big one. Just no energy, just can't get moving. And for those that experience it for the first time and don't know where it's coming from, they think it might be physical, right? They think it might be something going on, that they need to see their doctor about. So when people go to see their doctor, they talk about this in physical terms. I have no energy. I am feeling sluggish. I do have headaches. But oftentimes, it may not be anything physical. The physician will have to rule out any physical causes. And then there's difficulty concentrating, or remembering, making decisions. That's another symptom. Also, the idea of sleeping too much or sleeping too little. Waking up early can be another symptom of depression. Weight loss and gain is another big one. A person might be losing weight because they just, believe it or not, just don't have any interest in eating. Or they eat to basically soothe themselves because of the feelings that they're having. And then, of course, the end result for many are those thoughts of suicide, those suicidal ideations, as we call them. Suicide attempts. I am a suicide attempt survivor. I attempted suicide on several occasions. And for me, looking back on those days, it was as much as wanting to escape the pain. I just wanted the pain to go away. I just felt I couldn't go on. And thankfully, it didn't end up the way that perhaps I was planning. But now I recognize that that was really when I needed someone to support me. And I think at those times when I felt like I really had no other choice, I didn't feel supported. I didn't feel I could have anyone I could go and talk to. So once again, bring it back to the context of the church. I think we need to be there for those that need it, that might need that someone to talk to, that someone to be there for them. And you don't have to be a trained clinician. You don't have to be a counselor. You don't have to be a therapist. Just to be there to listen, to recognize maybe some of these signs and know how to help that person and refer them to where they can get help. So there may also be those persistent physical symptoms that don't respond to typical types of treatment. So there's some other things as well, headaches, digestive disorders, and other pains that can't be diagnosed. Anxiety is actually the number one mental health disorder that we know of. Approximately 19% of our population lives with out of the 1 out of 5 people living with mental health diagnosis, 19% of them live with an anxiety disorder. So about 1 out of 5. So it's very prevalent, and it's more common than what people would think. So really we're talking about that fight or flight. We all have anxiety. We've all felt it before. I often will use an example of thinking about your first date that you went through. I remember my first date. I was anxious, but it didn't keep me from going to school. It didn't keep me from doing my chores at home. It didn't keep me from my relationships with my friends. However, in some cases, people experience anxieties that's so profound that it does those things. It keeps them from, keeping those responsibilities or those relationships. So it's like that automatic alarm that goes off when we're faced with a stressful situation. So there are different types of anxiety disorders. Generalized anxiety disorder is a general sense of worrying. Panic disorder is also known as an anxiety attack. If anybody here has had an anxiety attack, you certainly know how distressful that can be, especially if you've never had one before. When people experience an anxiety attack, like I said, especially for the first time, they think they're having a heart attack. Their heart's racing, they have the tingling in their arms or their limbs. The mind is racing, hyperventilating. It's really, really scary, really scary. And we know that panic disorder can often accompany some of these other disorders. One thing we recognize too, there's a term called comorbidity. And the term is also known as co-occurrence, which is essentially when you might have 2 mental health disorders or a mental health disorder and a substance use disorder both at the same time, which can even make it sometimes more difficult to treat, especially when you talk about substance use and mental health together. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Which do you take care of? They're both co-occurring, so how do you address these things? Right now, in the mental health world, there is this idea of integrated treatment that is happening more often, where they are being addressed. These issues are both being addressed under the same, as I would call it, roof, or in the same environment, therapeutic environment. Social phobia is where people might feel uncomfortable in social situations, parties, groups. Specific phobia is being afraid of things like being afraid of heights, or dogs, or insects. So specific phobias are not as common. They're not as common. And they also don't typically impair a person to the point where they can't do those things they commonly would or should. Obsessive compulsive disorder, also known as OCD, is something that is based around ritualistic behaviors, checking, counting, cleaning. But what happens is when it's obsessive compulsive disorder, it's to the point where it impairs that person's life to the point where they can't function, they can't do things they normally would. It will keep a person from leaving the house because they have to keep going back to the stove to check to make sure it's turned off. Or when they leave the house, they have to keep checking the lock to make sure it's engaged repeatedly. I remember I was talking not too long ago, within the last year or so, to a mother. Her son was so impaired by OCD that, this is interesting, he couldn't get out of the house because he kept checking, but he kept missing his counseling appointments, so they had to close out his case. Now that sounds really absurd, right? To think about, this young man needed help, but he couldn't get it because he couldn't even get out of the house. So that's how profound and how prominent it can be in some people's lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder, of course, we now hear this all the time with our veterans, our military. But it isn't just military that deal with PTSD. It could be anyone who has experienced a traumatic event. And trauma itself has been shown to be a huge early indicator and risk factor for mental illness and substance use. Huge. Many, we're learning, if not most cases of mental illness and substance use have resulted early in a person's life from early childhood, whether it be childhood trauma or trauma in one point of a person's life or not. So it could be witnessing a crime, it could be a natural weather event, it could be loss of a loved one, right? It could be being in an accident, say like a car accident. All these things could produce PTSD, which is associated with nightmares and the ability to have these good relationships because of the fact that the stressors that are associated with it are so just debilitating that the person can't do what they need to do. And in fact, it's been known that some people that deal with PTSD are struggling to the point that their lives are completely different. I mean, you consider our military that are coming back now. Some of them have such difficulty reacclimating to society because of the PTSD that they've experienced. So this is yet another major anxiety disorder. So here we have the symptoms that we're looking at. The idea of overwhelming panic, fear of losing control, or as we say, as we use that term, crazy. I'm not really entirely happy about that word, but that's what some people think. Heart palpitations or chest pain, feel like you're going to pass out, hyperventilating, trouble breathing. So these symptoms of anxiety are really the things that a person would either feel, or you could even see them. We talk about signs and symptoms. Signs are things you can see, symptoms are things you can feel. So you might see a person who's hyperventilating. You might see a person that seems to be really distraught. You want to ask them, how are you feeling? What's going on? Is there something I can help you with? And I remember, I was in a program working, and I saw, a woman go into a full-blown panic attack. We had to address that in the moment. We had to talk to her. We had to help her de-escalate, help her to feel better. Also, hot flash or chills, tremor, shaking, nausea, that feeling of being detached or unreal. Schizophrenia is one of the, as I said before, serious or severe mental illnesses. It happens about 1% of our population. So we're a nation of roughly 350 or so million people, I guess. So 3.5 million people live with schizophrenia in our country. So it's associated with having delusions, which is basically have those thoughts of unreality, or those thoughts that are not based in reality, not grounded in reality. They might think that there's someone that they're not. Of course, we've always heard, I'm Jesus, I'm whoever. That's sometimes where the delusions come from. Hallucinations are sensory in nature, seeing, touching, tasting, hearing, feeling, things that aren't there. So hallucinations can be very disconcerting. However, for some people that have hallucinations, they've learned to live with them. We know that there are some individuals that hear voices. They're not voices that tell them to hurt someone or hurt themselves. They're voices that they become comfortable with. They learn to live with. There's a Hearing Voices Network, which is a support group that's basically around the world. People that come together that have this shared experience of hearing voices. That's their experience, and we have to respect that. There might be lack of concentration or difficulty remembering, loss of motivation involving self-care, blunted emotions, which is essentially where a person just doesn't react. No matter what you say, they just are pretty much just blank. They have no expression. They're flat. And then the idea of social withdrawal. And of course, that has a lot to do with these other symptoms where they may feel like they're not able to be around others. And then one thing that's not mentioned there, and is actually mentioned earlier today, about the idea of anosognosia. Often when you think about people, or when you know about people that have schizophrenia, severe mental illnesses like that, they don't have the insight to understand that they do have a mental disorder. You can't convince them otherwise that they do or do. So that's what makes it so difficult to treat, because they will say, I don't have it, I don't need medication, I'm fine. Even though the behavior indicates otherwise, but they don't recognize that. Bipolar disorder, like I said, I live with bipolar disorder. I have bipolar 1. And that is basically when you have mania, which is the more pronounced, I guess you could say, characteristic, followed by depression. So typically there's a period of, say, 2-3 weeks or whatever, maybe more, maybe less, of mania, followed by a deep crash of depression, which could last months. In fact, that's how it was in my case. Bipolar 2 is somewhat the other way around, where the person might experience more depression, but they have a condition called hypomania, which is typically not full-blown mania, but there are still some of the characteristics of the other symptoms you see there below. There might be that elevated mood or that increased energy, but not to the point where it's becoming as much of an impairment in their lives. But still, bipolar disorder is very common. It's actually, I believe, roughly 3% of our population lives with bipolar disorder in one type or another. They can also both be accompanied by psychosis. That's what I experienced, during my episodes when I was young. I would have psychosis that would go along with it. Psychosis is, once again, hallucinations, delusions, those things that are not grounded in reality. So there might be, for instance, that increased energy, that not wanting to sleep. I can fortunately say that's not my problem now. I love to sleep. But in the same respect, there are times when I wake up early and I'm awake, just not going back to sleep. So I sometimes have to ask myself, is that a function of my illness, or is that just a function of being a human being, right? Sometimes we have a lot going on. But also there's the idea of irritability, rapid thinking and speech, that lack of inhibitions. Some people that live with bipolar disorder find themselves getting into risky sexual situations or other situations where essentially they could be putting themselves or someone else at risk with their health. Grandiose delusions, once again, these beliefs that you can do things that are just so phenomenal that in reality aren't probably true or correct. And then once again, like I said, that lack of insight. When you talk about having a mental health condition, no matter what type it is, for that person, insight is so very important. I equate insight with self-awareness. So having insight is really important because you know what makes you tick. You know what your triggers are. You know what you need to do to stay healthy. I had to learn those things the hard way. I had a doctor, I had a counselor, but in the end, I had to learn what works best for me. And what works for one person might not work for the other. That's what makes also this whole world of mental health and mental illness so difficult sometimes. We're all a little bit different. We all have different ways of dealing with things. And then we have substance use disorders. There are, of course, any number of different substance use disorders, and you see here, alcohol, of course, is our primary substance that is abused. Accessibility, acceptance in society, tolerance. So alcohol is certainly something that is abused very commonly. Cannabis, is another one. This is, marijuana is certainly something that is very controversial these days in some areas. Medical marijuana, which is not always the same, if anything, the same as substance or recreational marijuana. But we know that marijuana use can increase the chance of schizophrenia in people that are vulnerable to schizophrenia. It has those psychoactive ingredients that can basically affect a person's mind to the point where they develop schizophrenia. Hallucinogens are also things that LSD or those types of substances can also be abused and end up having a person develop a mental health disorder. I was in the hospital once, actually one of my hospital stays, and there was a young man who basically all he would do would walk around and just spell his name. That's all he would do. And I talked to one of the nurses and I said, what happened to him? And the nurse said, oh, he just basically blew his brains out on acid. I said, wow, that really did it to him. And I was one of those people using that stuff. So I said, well, I better not use that anymore. But once again, insight. I learned a very valuable lesson, right? I mean, it may sound a little funny, but it's true. I had to learn what I had to stay away from. Opioids. We are in the midst of a major opioid epidemic right now. In my hometown of Buffalo in Erie County, 2 days ago we had 7 deaths related to heroin. One bad batch of heroin produced 7 deaths in a 24-hour period. 7 deaths. We have had more heroin deaths in my region, to this point of the year than we ever have had. Heroin and fentanyl, of course, is the ingredient that oftentimes is being included with heroin that makes it so deadly. So we are in the midst of a major opioid crisis. There's sedatives, Valium, things that are used to essentially be tranquilizers. Anxiolytics, which are essentially anti-anxiety medications, Xanax and Klonopin. And then stimulants, cocaine and methamphetamine. All these are substances that typically, for the most part, most of these, I would not call them anything that would be recreational in nature. Mind you, they might say recreational use of marijuana, whatever, but I don't really know any recreational opioid users, right? It just doesn't happen. So think about addiction and think about people that might be in our congregations that might be living with addiction. Sometimes you don't see it. Sometimes they can conceal it, especially, alcohol. There are people who use and abuse alcohol and they carry on about their lives, but when they get home, a whole different story. So we have to recognize that. And when you think about the criteria, I talked about, once again, what qualifies for disorders. So here we are looking at the criteria for substance disorders. One of the things we talk about is it's taken in large amounts and intended. So, for instance, a person might say they might want to start with 3 beers, but then they find themselves drinking 4 or 5, 6. Increase activity to obtain the substance, trying to, as we say, cop. A person might try to go out and they go to any means to find that substance. The failure to meet work or school obligations, that's a part of the disorder piece. Recreational activities given up. Recurrent use in risky situations. Sleep difficulty, nervousness, anxiety, and so forth. So these are things that we look at when we talk about a person having a substance use disorder. And right now, as it's categorized in the DSM, they're mild, moderate, and severe. Before, it used to be based on abuse and dependence. They've changed the criteria. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the implications of mental illness on spirituality itself. So once again, we know that when people are isolated, they feel abandoned, which can affect their sense of spirituality. This can affect their connectedness with other people, being part of that community. Also, some people that have mental illness feel that God has abandoned them, or that they're angry at God. Why me, people say. So this changes their values. This changes their belief system in terms of how they deal with their beliefs of God and because of the emotional pain they've experienced. Also, the idea of stigma alone, as we said before, is something that affects people in a way that when they go to church, they feel embarrassed. They feel like they can't talk about it, so that's big. And then, of course, the idea of hallucinations and delusions, sometimes people feel that God is speaking directly to them, right? You know, it's funny. You think about it this way. Our prophets, right? God spoke to them. What about me? Right? You know, I mean, I've heard God talking to me before. Why am I any different than Moses? Right? But you know, so we understand nowadays, though, that in many, obviously, pretty much most of these cases, they are truly mentally based. Now, there are some cultures, however, and I will say this, especially indigenous cultures, whether it be in the U.S. or other parts of the world, that believe that those who have these hallucinations are gifted. You know, they're not seen as being mentally ill. They're seen as being mentally, like emotionally and mentally gifted. So that's another thing too. But in terms of the church, especially the Western church, it's often been the thing that has really affected people very negatively. So we know that the relationship hasn't been very positive for people. You know, we know that there's a lot of places, a lot of room for growth, that people oftentimes have not been accepted, like I said before. There's a belief that people are possessed. You know, in some cases they're told that, you know, we have to exorcise the demon, or we have to pray it out. Right? I mean, as a trained clinician myself, I've worked in the field of mental health. I, for one, would never tell a person, pray it out. Now, I wouldn't say to the person, don't pray. Because I do believe that there is a spiritual component of our mental health and our overall well-being. But I don't believe that these things are necessarily taken care of just, you know, spiritually. It has to be a holistic, well-rounded approach, along with more traditional methods, whether it be medication, therapy, and otherwise. Now, we also know, however, that many major religious traditions have been looking at mental health and providing care in other ways. You know, we have faith community nurses. We have different people that are doing that work. And we do know that, you know, for many churches and many denominations, they actually have been on the forefront of helping people with mental health disorders and being caring and welcoming. But then we also know that there's some faith communities that don't welcome those, and that's what keeps people away. That's what drives people away from churches. So we do know also that when people have a family member that is living or been diagnosed, they will oftentimes go to their pastor or go to their faith community first for help. They don't know where else to go. They don't know about the resources, so they go to their church first. And finally, you know, overall we know that the faith community overlooks the needs of the mentally ill. It's prevalent but nearly invisible. Like I said, there's that stigma, that silence that surrounds it. So we have many barriers to effective ministry. You know, it's not a casserole disease. We've heard that term many times before, I'm sure, but it's not the kind of thing where people just deliver, you know, food and sympathy cards when someone's dealing with mental illness. You know, silence is the primary barrier. There's a lack of knowledge. You know, even many clergy don't have the proper knowledge and understanding of mental illness to know how to handle these situations, to know what to do when a person's in crisis. We need to be able to give people more resources, more understanding. Obviously, the media, like I mentioned before, is a big barrier. And then there's this disconnect between traditional treatment and also faith communities, where oftentimes, as the saying goes, the twain don't meet, that they don't intersect. You know, we have faith communities that may be trying to address these conditions. We have traditional providers trying to do this, but they often don't work together. And I think by bringing these two together, it could really make a big difference in terms of our communities. And then there's that lack of knowledge and also lack of financial resources. So we need more resources in our churches, and we need people to be better educated. So we also have to look at the cultural considerations, right? Because there are different cultural considerations when we talk about mental health. Different cultures look at different areas of mental health, look at mental health issues differently. So, one of the questions you might want to ask persons is, what would you like your provider to know about your religious or spiritual beliefs? So that is where that intersection, once again, between, the church community and the provider community can come together. When a person goes to get an assessment or an evaluation for mental health, they cover everything: family history, they cover, past history, they cover educational history. How often do they really delve into the person's spiritual life? It's often overlooked. So that's one thing we can do. We also have to recognize that too, also in some cultures, mental health and mental illness is not looked at, in a very positive light. Many people are, once again, stigmatized because of it. Also, in terms of forms of healing that are accepted, and is there a spiritual leader? Is there someone that person will want to go to talk to about what's going on? We have many times effective people in our congregations. It might not even be the pastor. It might be someone who attends the congregation who is a trained professional who can help. We need to engage these individuals into our ministry and our church so that people can get, to the resources and get to the place where they want to be in terms of their overall health. And then also, simply, what do you call your condition, right? Different people have different terms that they use. So, that's another thing to recognize when you're talking to someone. How do you see it? What is your understanding of it? When you think about it, as I said before, insight. That person may not have the complete understanding or the insight to even know what they're dealing with, especially if it's the first onset of the disease. They may not know what they're going through. They may not know what they're dealing with. And that produces confusion, fear, and that's a very scary place to be, because if you don't know what's going on, you don't know what to do. But we, as a people, we as being helpers, as I choose to call it, if we recognize that something's going on with someone, which oftentimes, like we talked about in the beginning, it's behavioral, you can see these things, don't be afraid to say something. How are you feeling? How are you doing today? Is there something I can do to help? Sometimes people need to know that you care. What do you think caused this? We want to ask them, why did this happen? What do you think? Right? And what do you think will happen? This is important because people are, like I said, are afraid. Imagine once again being that person who is newly diagnosed. They're afraid of the future. Am I always going to be this way? Right? Is my life going to ever be, I might have to take medication for the rest of my life. I hear that a lot. And that scares people. So that's something to think about. And then, in terms of just getting diagnosed and treatment, how will that affect the person's life? We always think about the idea of, as we say, being labeled. People oftentimes don't want to be labeled. They're afraid. However, if that person's able to get beyond that and understand that there's help available, hopefully they can accept it. So basically, in terms of creating a plan, families need an accepting, sympathetic, and well-informed community. This is, once again, this is what our churches can do to help. By going back to our churches and helping to start that conversation, to bring in those professionals that might be able to create a forum or a place to talk about it. That can be very valuable. Also, we want to have a place where people can express their feelings and share without fear of being rejected or condemned. That's important because when you think about it, if that person knows that they're going to be able to go and talk to someone and not feel that they're going to be criticized or judged, then they're more likely to talk. And then, of course, the role of the faith community is twofold. Being involved in the care and also advocacy. Advocacy is very important. Being able to provide that voice for people that don't have one. And there are a lot of ways you can do that. You can do that within the church, and you can also do it outside of the church. But it's a good place to begin. So these are some of the successful models that have been created to help in this area. Of course, we have the WISE covenant, right? Welcoming, inclusive, supportive, and engaged. That's why we're here today, right? The UCC Mental Health Network has developed this model to help churches be more welcoming of those living with mental challenges. So we've developed, liturgy for Mental Health Sunday. We have toolkits. We have resources on how to get help, how to help. It's on our website, mhn-ucc.org. Thank you. Once again, the resources are out there. Sometimes you just need to know where to go. And by being able to have this information, you share it with others. Right? And think about that. That simple act of sharing can make a big difference in a person's life. Then there's the model of friendship. You heard me mention this earlier. This was created by John Swinton, theologian. So we know that acceptance and friendship are powerful deterrents to internalization of stigma of mental illness by the mentally ill. So I work for an agency called Compeer. That's from where I work in Buffalo. And the Compeer program is about friendship. It's about being a friend to someone who has a mental health challenge. We work with children, adults, seniors, and veterans. So by providing that friendship, that person gets acceptance. By providing friendship, that person is less isolated. By providing friendship, they know that someone cares. We need to do that within our own congregations. We need to become friends with those who need it. We need to educate about friendship. Because Jesus, after all, Jesus preached about loving one's neighbor. Jesus preached about being a friend. There's the hymn is, I have a friend in Jesus, something like that. Yeah, we have a friend in Jesus. But we also should model that to those in our communities. Having a plan for church involvement. So that's important too. So, in terms of having a plan, that kind of ties in with WISE. So WISE is a formal plan that you can use. And then developing relationships with other agencies is really important. As I said before, the intersection between the faith community and the traditional service providers can be invaluable because we know that when those things are in place, that person oftentimes will have more success. The more supports that are out there, the better off the person's going to be. They may not be getting it from home, but if they're getting it from others, that can make a big difference, a huge difference in a person's life. And then we have creating caring faith communities, which is part of mental health ministries. It's a 5-step program based on education, commitment to intentional care, welcoming to the faith community, support, and advocacy. So as you see here, these criteria, these items in this 5-step program are very much like the things I mentioned before. A lot of that background, a lot of that information that could be used to help create faith communities that are more welcoming and are more accepting of those with mental illness. So this is the kind of thing that, once it's put into place, will really make a huge, huge difference in terms of how a congregation is accepting of others. And then communities of compassion and justice from the Commission on Mental Illness and Faith Fellowship for people with mental illness from the Archdiocese of Chicago. This is one that's, once again, based on education. You notice that's one of the themes, education. When you educate people, they're more likely to be accepting and not afraid, right? When you educate people, the myths just get dissolved. So we have to educate. Justice, What about looking at mental health and mental illness as a social justice issue, which it is? Think about our prison systems. The number one mental health institution these days in our country is our prisons and jails. So we need to address this from a social justice issue. What is the church going to do about it? What is our stance? And then, as you saw before, having a plan. Having a plan in place to address that is really, really crucial. And then also, I believe finally, Pathways to Promise, which has been around for a while. It's been around for many years. Once again, they provide a toolkit for mental health ministries. There's national resources. They do have a website, so if you Google Pathways to Promise, you'll be able to find that. They have monthly activities, education, community, hospitality, service, advocacy. Once again, these are all themes that you see across these various successful models. So by doing these things, you're really going to help your congregation to learn and to develop and to grow, to do the work that I believe we're being called to do in our ministry. So you have my contact information. I am in the Buffalo area. Also with the UCC Mental Health Network. Go to our website, check out the resources, go to the WISE page on our website. There is so much work to be done, but I believe that we're really at a good point. We're really, starting things off, at least within our denomination, and I look for really great things to happen. I really do. So thank you for your time, and thanks for being here.